integrated pest management for wildlife, and specifically in more urban or exurban areas. There's a lot to cover. Honestly, I could do an hour presentation on any of these species. So today it's a bit of a sampler of what the issues are and how we can address them for 5 different species, which are kind of the common ones that I often receive questions about. So I'll be going over California ground squirrels, gophers, deer, coyotes, and mountain lions. All right, so California ground squirrels. If you haven't seen them, one of the best ways to identify this species from tree squirrels, it's going to be that really distinctive white circle around the eye. You can also see they have a bit of a white saddle on their back. And if you're still not sure what kind of squirrel you're looking at, if you spook them and scare them, ground squirrels are going to run to the ground and back to their burrow, whereas tree squirrels will always run up for safety. Ground squirrels also are going to have really distinctive damage, as shown here on this avocado on the right, because they have really large front incisors. So you'll have that really distinctive pattern on any fruit damage you may come across. So for our current control strategies, with ground squirrels, you really want to use an integrated approach. And what I always recommend to people is to decide on a threshold for action. And what I mean by that is decide how many ground squirrels or how many active burrows or what level of damage is going to be your threshold before you come in and do a control strategy. And oftentimes what you'll need to do is do what's called a knockdown. So try to really come in, reduce the population by 70% at least. And from then on, it's going to be maintenance. Because even if you go through and remove a lot of ground squirrels, unless you've done something to alter, or depending if your neighbors are doing something or not, inevitably you're going to have recolonization and increase in population again on your property. So really you want to keep the numbers low enough that you're not having to do too much control at any one point to maintain below that threshold of problem. And really with ground squirrels, you're going to want to use their biology and ecology to decide your management decisions.
Hey, sorry to interrupt, Carolyn. Could you put it in presenter mode?
I'm so sorry. Yes.
Trouble reading.
I got flustered there and it started going off on me. Hopefully it won't start switching to the next slides. All right, sorry about that, guys. So for current control strategies, we're going to want to look at what time of year it is to decide what course of action we should take. And that's because during a particular time of year, typically November through mid-January, ground squirrels are actually going to be hibernating. So that's really going to limit what our options are. And of course, I'll have these charts that are giving, what month and what kind of action, but keep in mind that it'll vary year by year, especially if you're having California, oftentimes we have these drought years or not quite as much precipitation and different temperatures than average. And that, of course, is going to affect ground squirrel behavior and when they're choosing to hibernate. So if we're looking at how to time our management actions for ground squirrels, a lot of information on this slide, but let me just quickly break it down. So we have the month of the year at the top here for the columns. And the first 2 rows are going to be activity levels. So we can see that adult activity and then juvenile activity. And then below that, we have the different management strategies that are available to us and what time of year they should be used and how effective they are. And why this matters is because when we're talking about something like baiting or toxic baits, it's really important to know what the ground squirrels are eating at that time of year. Because if they're still eating green forage, which is typically, mid-January through mid-May, the toxic baits aren't going to work. The ground squirrels aren't going to be interested in eating them. So you're going to want to, as you're thinking through what strategy you're interested in using, make sure you pay attention to the time of year and make sure you pay attention to what the ground squirrels are doing. So go out there and look, what are they eating? Is it time yet to potentially use toxic baits? are we seeing activity or are they still hibernating? So make sure that you do pay attention. And if you want access to that previous chart and a lot of the information I'll be talking about, there's a really handy website called Squirrel BMP that was put together by, I believe, some colleagues. And so you'll be able to find these charts there for reference. And of course, when you're thinking through what your available options for control, you're always going to want to consider what endangered species are present on the property. So, you know, if you're going to be doing something like fumigation, which will kill anything living in the burrows, of course, you need to be, make sure you're not having endangered species that are present in those burrows. And there's a really nice website called Prescribe on the DPR website, or a page within the DPR website. And this is great if you're not sure if you have endangered species on your property. You can go through on Prescribe, input your location information, and it'll help you determine what species you may need to be keeping an eye out for. So to quickly go through some of the different control methods. First, let's talk about toxic baits. So as I mentioned earlier, you're going to want to do this when the ground squirrels are eating seeds. You're going to have two broad categories of baits that you can use. So you can use first generation anticoagulants, or you can use an acute toxicant, zinc phosphide. Now, if you're deciding between what kind of toxic bait, lots of comparisons between these FGARs and zinc phosphide. In terms of efficacy, bait acceptance, probably one of the most important differences is going to be antidote availability. So for FGARs, there is going to be an antidote available, whereas zinc phosphide, there is no antidote available. But please don't rely on this availability of antidote. If there is any concern that a non-target is going to be getting into your bait, then you shouldn't be baiting. The antidote, while it's available, it's not going to be 100% effective. So don't let that solely drive your decision making. There's going to be, a lower non-target risk for FGARs. For secondary toxicity, there's some potential for risk, essentially no risk of secondary toxicity for zinc phosphide. But there are going to be differences in cost, in time to death, and in restrictions. So many factors to consider in deciding which bait you may want to use. For first generation anticoagulants, you're going to be able to use these for spot treatments, broadcast, or in bait stations. In a bait station, two examples of what they can look like are shown here to the right. These work by requiring multiple feedings. As I said, there is an antidote available, though don't rely on it. And of course, like with any toxic bait, you're going to want to check regularly and collect carcasses. Now, the acute toxin zinc phosphide, if you want to use this, you're going to need to be a licensed professional, and there is some potential for bait shyness, so that's something to be aware of. You can use this for spot treatments and broadcast baiting, but not for bait stations. So make sure you are not using zinc phosphide in a bait station. It's also not going to be permitted for use in or around buildings. And always make sure to check the label because it's going to be species specific for many areas. Now, when we're talking about pesticides or any of these toxic baits, of course, there's going to be rules and regulations that you're going to want to follow. And many of these options for ground squirrel control are going to be restricted materials. So if you're using a restricted material, of course, you're going to need a restricted materials permit. So if you're interested in using zinc phosphide or aluminum phosphide, you're going to need this. The restricted materials permit is going to be the responsibility of the owner of the property or the business operator. So whoever the applicator is really needs to make sure that the owner of the property has the material listed on their permit, because the applicator is actually going to be the person that receives the violation if the permits aren't in order. And if you ever have any questions about what permits are necessary, I'd recommend reaching out to your local ag office, the county ag office. since they're the ones that are going to be giving out the fines, right? So they know how to avoid these violations and can let you know exactly what you're going to need depending upon what you're interested in putting on. So you're going to need to give a notice of intent as well if you're using a restricted use material. This has to be given to your county ag commissioner's department at least 24 hours before you're applying the restricted use material. And the applicator has up to 4 days after the planned application date, so whatever the date on the notice is, to begin the application. Now, if the application is not started within 4 days, you're going to have to file a new notice of intent. And that's important to remember because, for some of these, weather is going to be a big factor. So, let's say you were planning on putting this stuff out, a big storm rolls in, delays you a week. Remember that you're going to have to do a new notice of intent. And, when we're looking through these different sorts of areas in terms of where you're going to need potentially doing this notice of intent. Of course, always have the one thing I did want to mention on this. So if you're applying, depending on who you are, if you're going to be applying these things on public land, you're going to need a written recommendation, or if a pest control business may be able to do that for you from your pest control advisor, who is the one that's writing the written recommendation. If you're a private landowner or an operator, you're not going to need a written recommendation. So again, any questions about that, your county ag office will be able to help you figure all of that out. And of course, always have a copy of the label with you whenever you're using a pesticide. And this is, really to help protect you, right? Because it's going to have instructions in case of ingestion, exactly what you need to do. So either have a printed copy of the label or, have it downloaded on your phone. Just make sure that you always have it on you. All right, switching over to fumigation. This is only going to be an effective tool when the soil is moist. So typically, and when the ground squirrels are active. When the ground squirrels are hibernating, they actually seal themselves off in the burrow. So no matter what you put down the burrow, it's not going to impact them. So make sure that the ground squirrels are active, yet it's not, soil isn't so dry that the gas will be able to permeate through and also not be effective. So keep that in mind, when you've had the last rainfall. Now for fumigation, you're also going to have 3 options. So you could use gas cartridges, you can use aluminum phosphide, or you can use carbon monoxide. Now gas cartridges, for the most part work. Remember, we're aiming for like a 70% threshold. That's ideal. So you can reach that. Studies show between 62 and 86% control for ground squirrels. And I will mention for gas cartridges, you can buy these in the hardware store. So that's, a pro for using them, is that you don't need a special permit. Whereas for aluminum phosphide, this is a restricted material. So you will need a restricted use permit to purchase this and to use it. And you're also going to need to be a qualified applicator or be supervised by a qualified applicator to use aluminum phosphide. It's going to be heavily restricted by location and proximity to people and domestic animals. So of course, check the label to see if you're able to use it on your property. And while this is very effective, you also aren't going to be able to use this when it's actively precipitating because of the mechanism of it. So if it's raining, you cannot use aluminum phosphide. And you're going to have to be really careful with this. Of course, seal the burrows and make sure you're not near buildings. There have been really tragic instances of people not handling aluminum phosphide correctly and not applying it correctly. And, people have died from this. So you do need to be very careful. A side benefit of aluminum phosphide is that it will kill fleas that are in the burrow, whereas gas cartridges aren't. And so if fleas are an issue, maybe you want to think more about using aluminum phosphide. And then third, we have carbon monoxide machines. Potential advantages, it could be safer to use. You can use one machine and do multiple applications with it. Downsides are that they're expensive. So it is a big upfront cost. And you're going to want to think through, what size machine, how many people are you going to be able to have using these? And keep an eye out for new CDPR regulations. I've heard that they're probably coming. Right now, there aren't regulations regarding this, but make sure to check before you're considering using carbon monoxide. And then trapping. So this can be really effective for control of small populations of ground squirrels. You're going to be able to use them for, the longest period of time throughout the year. It's really whenever ground squirrels are active. So, longer time, but it's going to be more human intensive. So, cost of labor is something to consider with trapping. Who can trap? Well, it's going to be required, or a light trapping license will be required if you're trapping for profit. But you're not going to need a license if you're the homeowner. County employees don't need a trapping license, but of course you do need notices and written recs for pesticides and such. So you have a few different options for kinds of traps. You have, kill traps, which are commonly going to be these body gripping traps, tube traps, box type squeeze traps, or conifer traps. You'll often have live traps. And commonly these are going to be wire cage traps. And these can either catch a single individual or they can catch multiple individuals. But something to consider when you're using a live trap is that it's still going to require euthanasia of the ground squirrels. So you can't just catch them and release them somewhere else. That's illegal. So if you catch them, you're going to have to euthanize them, and you're going to need to follow AVMA guidelines when it comes to euthanasia. And again, feel free to ask questions. That's a whole talk in and of itself. But I do want to mention that drowning is not allowed as a euthanasia technique. And I mention that just because I hear people being like, oh, I'll just drown them. No, you can't. That is illegal. And whenever you're using any of these traps, of course, please wear gloves to protect yourself. So this is an example of one of these multi-catch traps. And I mean, one of these can catch, upwards of 10 squirrels at once. If you're going to use one of these traps, it's really important to pre-bait. And so what I mean by that is you're going to want to put some bait within the trap, but not set it. And be careful with your placement of the bait. Ground squirrels are really smart. And so they'll be able to reach in with their arm or their legs. I've heard stories where they'll prop open the door with their tail and reach all the way in and grab the bait. So you want to be careful in how you're placing the bait. For time of year when they're eating green forage, like around now, I'd really use some high value bait like melon. Can work really well, I've heard, for this time of year, something that they're really going to want. And the reason you're pre-baiting for a few days before you actually set the trap is you want to get the older, more experienced ground squirrels comfortable with the trap. If you're not pre-baiting and you just set it, you're likely only going to be catching the young, teenage ground squirrels, which are more brazen. They're not going to be as cautious, and that's not going to be helpful for controlling the population if you're only catching the youngsters. Also, with these multi-catch traps, if you do get one of the mature ground squirrels in there, they'll call, and that'll themselves pull in other ground squirrels. So you really just want to catch that oldest, smartest individual, and then they can help you catch the rest. If you're using conifer traps, which are lethal, you can place them at the burrow entrances. Of course, you don't want to do this if there's risk of non-targets also using that burrow. You can also place the conifer traps inside boxes, as shown here, to bait ground squirrels, but also excluding larger animals. But again, these conifer traps, they're really tightly sprung. So, if a little kid reaches through, it can break an arm. So be careful when setting traps. You want to make sure that you're not going to be hurting any non-targets. And then lastly, biocontrol. I hear about this a lot. Natural predators historically have been used to control vertebrate pests. Of course, owl boxes are not going to be appropriate for ground squirrels. Ground squirrels aren't active at night. But so far, the research shows that raptor perches appear to be ineffective, but they can't hurt, right? If you want to encourage raptors to be using those properties, I don't see a downside in that, but I probably wouldn't rely on them, solving your ground squirrel problem for you. And I just want to round out ground squirrels, I just want to touch upon non-target impacts of pesticides. And you've probably seen, certainly in the media, there's more and more talk about this, in public opinion, being worried about these non-target impacts. And these this concern, we're talking about wildlife, has largely come from secondary exposure from anticoagulant rodenticides. And this is an issue that's being found quite broadly. Research on mountain lions by CDFW back in 2016, they actually detected first generation anticoagulant rodenticides in 73% of the sampled mountain lions, and found second generation anticoagulants, rodenticides, in 92% of the sampled mountain lions. So these rodenticides are finding their way up the food chain. And this has led to this recent AB 1788, and who knows in the future what'll be passed. So I really just encourage everyone using rodenticides to be cognizant, be careful in your use of them. Make sure you need to use it. And sometimes it is going to be the best control method for your property. But if there are alternatives that would work for you, maybe consider using those, and just, as much as possible, try to be targeted in your use of rodenticides so that you can achieve the same goal of ground squirrel control, but, minimize the potential for secondary exposure and non-targets getting in. All right, so switching gears over to gophers, although another burrowing rodent. When we're talking about, typical gopher mounds, this is what you'll, often see. We have this distinctive mound of dirt and the hole going in at 45 degrees. So this is, quintessential gopher mounds right here. When they're a bit older, or if there's been a lot of wind, they have blown off that dirt. So you can just be left with these holes. And these are dangerous. People, you can step in it and break your ankle, and it can be a threat to infrastructure, which is why gophers can be so problematic on a lot of properties. Conversely, mole mounds, which oftentimes people will confuse for gophers, but to tell them apart, mole mounds, as you see, like this one here, because the moles are going to be burrowing straight down at 90 degrees, the mound of dirt is going to cover that hole. So it's just like a mound, and the burrow is directly underneath instead of that angle. There we go. Again, we want to use an integrated approach for gophers. And today I'm going to be touching upon the methods that have been shown to be effective. So habitat modification, baiting, burrow fumigation, trapping, and exclusion. So habitat modification, this is going to be, in general better for rural ag areas, but I do want to mention it because if, you are redoing a garden or a small property where you're completely redoing the landscaping, then potentially you can do this deep disking and ripping where you're going in and ripping the soil, 12 to 18 inches and just destroying those burrows. And that can, at least help get rid of those existing burrows and also delay potentially new ones, new gophers moving in. Exclusion. So this, isn't going to be effective for huge areas, but if you have a small area or you have some high value plants, as you're planting them, I would encourage you to think ahead, are gophers going to be an issue? So if you have a few particularly high value plants, you can put in wire baskets around them. If you're redoing your garden, you can put in underground fencing. You can use hardware cloth or wire mesh. Just make sure it's between 1/2 and 3/4 of an inch. And this can be effective for relatively smaller areas. Baiting is also an option. This is for gophers, mostly restricted use in California and less used by the homeowner. You're going to have a few more options. So you have anticoagulants, zinc phosphide, and strychnine. Do mention, if you're putting this in your garden where you're growing root veggies, you might want to avoid this. And again, you only are going to want for gophers to place the bait underground. So this is, very different from ground squirrels, or placing it on top of the ground. For gophers, we want it down in their burrows. A lot same difascinone and chlorofascinone for first generation anticoagulant rodenticides. Of course, as I mentioned, require multiple feedings. Relatively low risk of secondary toxicosis. So you can use this when you're worried about the primary toxicity from other products. Strychnine. So this is allowed for gophers. It is not allowed for ground squirrels. It's an acute toxicant. And because of this acute toxicity, it actually is a preferred bait for controlling gophers. It's going to be more palatable, has better flavor than zinc phosphide. It's extremely effective for gopher control. But there is a current shortage of strychnine baits, so you may not be able to find it, and it's getting really, really hard to track this down, which then you may need to switch over to zinc phosphide. This is more readily available. You are going to need the license because it is, restricted use material. It can also be effective, although gophers can develop bait shyness to this. For bait application, what you're going to want to do is first, of course, locate the burrow. So you'll want to use a bait probe or just a metal rod, and you're going to be probing down into the soil until you locate that main tunnel. So you'll, as you're pressing it down into the soil, you can feel where it suddenly the probe falls through a few inches, and that's because you've hit the tunnel. You're then going to dig a little hole, place the bait down into it. Of course, following the label, it'll tell you very specifically about how much bait to use. And then you're going to want to cover that hole back up. And again, follow the label. They'll also tell you how many treatments per burrow system you need to use. And as long as there's gopher activity, you want to maintain bait in that burrow system. And again, do not apply the bait on the surface of the soil. So shown here, if we just want to take a closer look at what these burrows look like. So there's going to be that main run, that main tunnel, which is what you're aiming for, really for, either trapping, which I'll be talking about next, or baiting. You don't want to be confused by these like ancillary or lateral tunnels that are going typically more at a 45-degree angle up to the surface. So as you're using your probe to go through, once you have found a burrow, you're still going to want to check to see, do I think this is a lateral chute, or is this the main run? The main run will be typically bigger, more flat run versus angular. And this is, kind of visual of how it works. So you're going to open up the burrow, put the bait down, and then close it back up. All right, so for fumigation, while gas cartridges were effective for ground squirrels, they're not effective for gophers, so don't use them for gophers. Aluminum phosphide, on the other hand, is highly effective. You get 90 to 100% control with that. But again, it's a restricted use pesticide, so it'll limit your options and the negatives, as I discussed for ground squirrels. You can use carbon monoxide for gophers as well. And if we're actually looking at the relative efficacy of these different fumigants, you'll see there, aluminum phosphide, very effective. Gas cartridges, really not. PERC, which is a carbon monoxide machine, that is one brand. There are multiple out there that are continuously being improved upon. As of current research, PERC has outperformed others such as cheetah, certainly for ground squirrel control. When we're looking at PERC for gopher control, you see a range here. So you can get real close to that 70%, 68% efficacy. So a little bit more variable, more research to be done certainly on using carbon monoxide. Traps. So this is kind of what I hear the most commonly used for gopher control. There are a lot of different trap options out there, as you probably are aware, if you've ever dealt with gophers. One of the main things you may want to consider when you're deciding what type of trap to use is how much turf or additional turf damage you're willing to incur. Traps like the Gophinator or Maccabee or this black hole and box, so the ones shown on that top row, they're going to require a bit more excavation of the burrow system to place the traps down in them. So if it's really high value turf and you really don't want to have to dig or like widen the burrow hole to get these traps down, you may not want to use them. Whereas traps such as the cinch trap or the gopher hawk shown on that bottom row, they're not going to require that same excavation of the burrow. So it's not just about efficacy, it's also about turf damage when you're thinking about what kind of trap to use. And there's been a lot of great research done on gopher trapping, and it's done right here in California, actually by some of my colleagues. And what they've looked at is comparing Maccabee versus Gophinator, which are two different kinds of traps, and to see, is there a difference in efficacy if you cover them versus leave them uncovered, if you use an attractant versus no attractant, if the person placing the traps is trained versus untrained, and if you use gloves versus no gloves. So like, does the human scent impact your ability to catch gophers? And what they've, so here we go. This is what the two traps look like. Sorry, Maccabee on the left and then Gophinator on the right. And the Gophinator has, it's built to be able to catch larger gophers. It has a tighter grip on the gopher when it catches them. And so as we see here, it grips the animal higher up on the body than Maccabee does. And it has this trigger arm offset to prevent the upward pressure on the gopher. And rotating pincher arm as well. So a little bit different design than Maccabee. And what they found is those adjustments allow this trap to capture larger gophers. So if we're looking here at capture rate, overall the Gophinator caught more gophers and more larger gophers, which are going to be those mature individuals, which is really great to catch. But I mean, Maccabee is also effective. In terms of, do you need to cover the trap or leave it uncovered? Do you see a difference? And they did not find a significant difference between covering the trap or not. What about attractant versus no attractant? They did not find a significant difference here. So if you want to use an attractant, great, but that's not going to significantly increase the number of gophers you're going to catch. What about trained versus untrained? Well, they found that the untrained person at first, day one, had about 45% capture rate, but there was a real quick learning curve there. So you can, after a few days of trapping, you will get better, but at first you will not be as good as a trained person. So thinking through, how long do you send out an untrained, technician to set these traps? For the first few days, they won't be as effective, but they'll learn quickly. And really overall, these, I think, is great news, right? It's saying that, less effort, not having to cover, not having to place a bait or a attractant doesn't make a difference. So I view that as good news, right? Less work to still be able to catch gophers effectively. And just some tips for when you're setting traps. You should be staking these traps in the ground, ideally with a flag, so that people know there's a hole there. Also, so you remember where you set the traps. Think through if you need to inform members of the community. Downside, it could lead to vandalism of trap sets, but you don't want someone accidentally stepping in one of these excavated holes that you've widened to set the trap. So things to think about there. You don't want a pet dog digging up one of these traps that has a gopher in it, if it's an area where dogs are allowed. So things to think through. If you're trying to decide between trapping and fumigation, and of course, with any of these, it's the same issue with endangered species. So of course, consider if you have endangered species on the property or not. But other than that, Aluminum phosphide, has a very short application time. Perk machine, you can do a lot more applications though, because you can be treating multiple burrows at once. Overall, trapping and aluminum phosphide are more efficacious than the perk machine. So there's no clear answer here. Just think through kind of your costs, your labor, the amount of time you have to be doing this, and which is going to work the best for your system, what the permitting restrictions are, all of that. For small scale management efforts, aluminum phosphide is very effective and cost effective. For a greater number of treatments, research has found trapping was the most effective management strategy. You also think through, aluminum phosphate may not be permitted on your property, or you may not have the necessary permits for it. So trapping can be an excellent alternative. When you're doing it, if you are choosing trapping route, of course, you're going to need the traps, the probe, right? So you got to find these burrows and you got to find that main tunnel. Of course, gloves, remember, for any trap. Wire to attach the trap to your flag. And then knee pads can be nice because you're spending a lot of time on the ground. You're going to first want to look for active mounds. That'll, if it's an old mound, you might not actually catch the gopher. Of course, probe for that tunnel. Keep an eye out for backfilled tunnels. That can happen. So you want to try to find an active one. Once you dig that hole, examine it for, is it big, small? Does it have turns, divides? That can all help you decide if it's the main run or one of the lateral runs. And one last thing is that because gophers are territorial, they're going to be checking their main run daily. So if you set out a trap in a burrow and 2-3 days later you haven't caught anything, move the trap. There's not activity there. So don't think that, oh, eventually it'll come. No, they're territorial. They are checking their area. So if you haven't caught anything in a few days, you're not going to. All right, so sorry, that was a lot on burrowing rodents. So now we'll go to bigger wildlife. Deer, these can be, may love seeing them. They can be quite destructive for gardens or for some high value plants or, saplings that you may be putting out there. When it comes to deer, fortunately or unfortunately, fencing is going to be the best bet. It's going to have to be a tall fence if you're trying to exclude deer. They can jump, so you're going to need it to be at least 8 feet high. It can be made of wire or electrified. It can be mesh, or you can have wire strands with a low wire close to the ground, because deer will go under fences. And if you're using electrified fences, you don't always have to have it quite as tall. But what you will need to do is bait them. And this is because, let's say you have your fence, and say if they can't jump over it, if they go under it and the hot wire hits the top of the shoulders or their back, they're really not going to feel it through their fur on their back. So it's not going to prevent them from continuing to go under. So what you need to do is you need to get them to come into contact with that hot wire on their nose or their tongue or their face, somewhere where they're going to get a zap and they're not going to like it. So you're going to need to bait to get that interaction. So like peanut butter is what people often use. You'll put these little like tabs on the wire, put peanut butter on it, and the deer will come and lick it, and that'll then get their nose to touch the fence and will teach them, oh, I don't want to touch this barrier. But the labor is going to be pretty high for having to do that. You got to keep out peanut butter because there may be a new deer that comes and hasn't learned to respect your fence. So it can be quite a lot of work, and expensive to put up fences, right? It's not cheap to erect fences. But unfortunately, if you're really trying to exclude deer, that's going to be your best bet. If you have, seedlings or younger high value plants, netting and tubing that you'll often see, you're going to want to do. Coyotes. So I certainly get a lot of coyote calls. They I know where I grew up in the Bay Area, and I've really noticed a big shift in the number of coyotes that I've seen in my neighborhood over the years. So a lot more reported sightings in a lot of these more urban areas where people aren't necessarily used to having a neighborhood coyote and are not sure how to handle it. So I like to go over some background coyote biology because I think it kind of helps us understand, what the behavior is, what's normal, what is more worrying, and how we can address potential concerns with coyotes. So they can be solitary or in packs, not unusual for coyotes to be in family groups. Their territory size varies based on resource availability and their sex, and it can vary widely. And in some of these urban areas, like I have a colleague down in Southern California who's put some GPS collars on coyotes, and there's one individual that's home range is only a half square mile, just right in this little neighborhood, right around a little neighborhood park, and it doesn't have to go any further than that. It has all the food it needs. Whereas, in areas where there's not as much food, you can have, many square miles for one individual. So highly variable. Their lifespan's 8 to 10 years in the wild. So you can have your same neighborhood coyote around for quite a while. And they're really the ultimate opportunistic omnivore. And I mean, they're so adaptable. They've really figured out how to live in these suburban and even urban areas. They're primarily going to go after small rodents and mammals. So really, your gophers, your ground squirrels, these guys will go after them. So not necessarily, if you're having issues with them, you may want to see a coyote on that property. But they're also, also going to go after your fruit, your nice fruit tree, your cherry tomatoes that you've planted, your blackberry bushes, insects, your eggs. So might go into your chicken coop, go after your chickens. They like birds as well. Really just about everything they'll get into. They'll even go after, deer. And of course, unfortunately, pets. And this is where I get a lot of calls and a lot of concerns. They will absolutely go after your outdoor cat. If your cat is outside and there are coyotes around, it is at risk. They will go after small dogs. If you have, a pack of coyote, they can also go after big dogs, even, golden retriever size. There's been research showing where the coyotes will hang around feral cat colonies because that's such a great food source for them. In urban environments, they're generally shy around people, but in some areas, they've definitely lost or are losing their fear of humans. And really, the biggest thing with coyotes is that when they begin associating people with food, that's when they start acting aggressive. And when you look at bites, so coyote bites, in Southern California, it's kind of been a regular issue for years. Pretty much every time, when they go through, they remove the coyote, they, are interviewing people, trying to find out more about, this coyote's behavior. Pretty much every time they later on discover that someone in the neighborhood was feeding that coyote. So there's a really strong association here. And it may not be purposeful feeding, you do have the people that, think that coyotes are cute and they want to, help them. They mistakenly think that they're helping them by, putting out food for coyotes. But you also have people that aren't aware and they're just putting out food for their cat or their dog and they don't pick it up. And then the coyote gets into it. Or they're people not securing their trash, or people forget that their compost pile can be a really great food resource for coyotes. So it can be completely unintentional where people are feeding coyotes. But once that starts happening and coyotes figure out, people equal food, that's when you're really going to start having issues. It's important to remember their reproduction cycle because this often corresponds with when you get the most calls and the most concerns around coyotes. They're going to breed once per year, so we're in the tail end of their breeding season, and they're going to then excavate dens, or they'll use culverts or hollow logs or rock piles. So you can really, under a deck, figure out a lot of places to have their den. They'll have, on average 6 pups that are born between March and May. And that's really when you can have an increase in perceived coyote aggression or true coyote aggression, because coyotes are going to be defending their den area from anything they perceive as a threat. So you may have, let's say a park where people regularly walk their dogs every day, and the coyotes hadn't bothered them before, but all of a sudden denning season rolls around and there happens to be a den right next to the trail, and man, every time someone walks down there, coyotes are going to act aggressive, and people are like, I don't understand, there's such a shift in the behavior. And that's often a result of denning season, which is good and bad, because then people may have to change their behavior for those few months. But on the good side, oftentimes then when denning season's over and the pups are dispersing, the problem goes away, and you're not having coyotes acting a little bit more aggressive. So something to keep in mind, especially over these next few months, if you are having an increase in your coyote issues. So, what happens when the public is fed up and they don't want their neighborhood coyote? I often have people asking, why can't we just relocate this individual? And unfortunately, it is, well, not necessarily unfortunately, but for them, they certainly view it as unfortunately, it's illegal to capture and relocate wildlife in California. So this can be really important to explain to people that you can't just catch this coyote and release it somewhere else. And why not, right? Let's understand why this is the case. There's a really good reason why you can't relocate wildlife, or many reasons actually. Not only are you only moving the animal and moving it to someone else's problem, right? So, this animal was your problem, now you're just going to put it on someone else. But you can also be spreading disease. So you can, if you're moving an animal, you don't know if you're going to be introducing a disease to a different population. You're also, sorry, excuse me, I'm going to be increasing territorial disputes. So if you are catching a coyote, putting it into coyote habitat, there's already going to be another coyote living in that coyote habitat. And now they're going to be competing for that same territory. You're also, that animal that you're relocating, you're putting it into an unknown area where it doesn't know where to get food, doesn't know where to find shelter. So really, in and of itself, you can be setting up this animal for a lot of suffering. So it's something to be, this is why you can't do it. So given that, what can you do to deal with your neighborhood coyote? Sorry. Biggest thing is going to be to remove attractants. So secure your compost. Bird seed, another thing that people don't often think about. Coyotes love bird seed. That's a lot of nutrients right there. So, birds, when they feed, as you are probably all aware, right, a lot of that seed drops to the ground. So you may need to just get rid of your bird feeder. Secure your trash. Pick up fallen fruit. Don't leave pet food outside. If you do need to feed an animal outside, feed it, then pick it up immediately. You can remove ground level shrubbery that coyotes can hide in. Don't make them able to hide and be watching for an attack. If you are wanting to build a fence to exclude coyotes, coyotes can climb and they can jump. It's going to have to be a tall fence, and you may want to put something like a coyote roller on top of the fence. And what that does is when coyotes jump, and what they'll do is they'll jump up and they'll grip with their front legs to then pull themselves over. If you have a coyote roller, it moves. So what they do, they try to cling on to that, and it's unstable, so they can't then pull themselves over. Coyotes also love to dig. So you're going to want to put a no-dig skirt buried at the edge of your fence. That's a big thing. Coyotes will absolutely dig. If you're going on walks with your small dog at dawn and dusk, and that's the only time you have to go on this walk, there's no way you can change your behavior. Something you can do to help protect yourself is carry an air horn with you, or a empty can that has pebbles or coins in it, something that can make a really loud noise and can help scare a coyote off if they approach you. Just like with all carnivores, don't run away if you have a coyote approaching you. Stand your ground, yell at them, throw a rock at them, try to do something to move them off. If a person is bitten, immediately contact CDFW or law enforcement. That is now a public safety issue that needs to be immediately addressed. But if there hasn't been a bite and just a coyote is getting too close to comfort for you, really try to push them off. Be very aggressive in how you yell at them. Make loud noise. Maybe carry a stick, that sort of thing, to help protect yourself. Hazing. So this is something that you'll often hear discussed when it comes to coyotes and encouraged. I have to say, from a scientific perspective, the jury's still out on whether it's effective or not. And there is ongoing research by colleagues of mine on does hazing coyotes actually alter their behavior. So stay tuned. Hopefully in the next few years, we'll have a much better understanding of the impacts of hazing. Anecdotally, I've heard accounts both ways. So some people I've worked with, hazing has really solved their problems, and they didn't have any issues with coyotes. Other people have tried hazing with no success. So with that in mind, you can think through if this is something you want to try. For hazing, the underlying theory of it is that you are teaching the coyote to associate unwanted behavior, such as getting close to you or being in your yard, with something negative. So that can be blasting them with a hose, or throwing rocks at them, or chasing them, banging pots and pans, that sort of thing. And every time they do this unwanted behavior, if they come across this negative impacts, then the theory is they'll learn to stop doing that unwanted behavior. So really but in general, stand up for yourself. Don't run, and try to, discourage coyotes from developing these bad behaviors. All right. Lastly, thanks for sticking with me, guys. I know this is a blast of information. I'm sorry, this is a lot to cover. But lastly, I want to talk about mountain lions. And, there are some changes in rules just this last year and potentially going forward. So this passed, about exactly a year ago. They were proposed to be listed as threatened species, and that includes the population in San Mateo County. And what that means is it's going to change, the rules surrounding what can be done with these species. And honestly, we'll see exactly how many rules get impacted based on the listing. It's not 100% clear. A final decision as to the listing will be made the next few months, and then we'll know if they officially will be listed as threatened. Now, in general, not much to worry about with mountain lions. Of course, they're active at night, dawn and dusk, so be aware of that. It's where you might, I wouldn't recommend jogging in open space by yourself at dawn or dusk, right? Increasing your chances. With the increase in so many Nest cameras and remote cameras, we are learning a lot more about their use of suburban areas. There have been sightings in Belmont, in quite far east, or a few miles east of 280, of mountain lions going through at night. And, my brother lives in that area and has some young kids, and he's always like, should I be worried? It's like, don't let your kids out at 2 a.m. Let's be smart and cautious about it. But honestly, they, for the most part, want to avoid people. I will say, for mountain lions, really what we got to do, what I personally am most concerned about, is protecting livestock and pets. They absolutely will go after outside cats. If you leave your dog out at night, they are at risk to a mountain lion, and especially small stock like goats and sheep. They really 100% are at risk of mountain lions. You need to be careful. If you are considering getting a few, pet goats, that's something to consider, is, do you have the infrastructure and the time to adequately protect them? So what can you do? Golden standard is going to be fully enclosing your livestock and your pets in at night. You can use an enclosure like this one. A friend of mine had these alpacas, didn't have a night enclosure, just had a 6-foot fence, and lost half the herd to a mountain lion in one night. And so since then built this nighttime enclosure that has a roof. That's key, right? Mountain lions can jump 12 feet in the air, needs to have a roof. And that completely solves your problem. So, appropriate fencing. Things that are currently being researched. So myself, I'm looking at the efficacy of motion activated sound alarms. Can those work as a deterrent for mountain lions? Fox lights, will those be effective? Kind of mixed results on that so far. Fladry, more typically associated, with like wolves or coyotes, but can this also help with mountain lions? And these are, like flags that wave that, can kind of act as a deterrent. Livestock guardian animals. So as Rich mentioned, I have a lot of experience with these. I used to breed them and help place them with small stock farmers. These can be very effective. Also come with downsides, right? So think through if it's, given your property, if it makes sense, depending where you are. If it's, small parcels and you're quite close to your neighbor, remember that these dogs work largely by barking and letting predators know that they're around. So your neighbor may not appreciate barking through the night because, the dog senses there's a coyote or something around, or a mountain lion around, and is barking. It's doing its job. But that can be a noise hazard or noise complaint. So be aware of that. But what's great about livestock guardian animals, in particular the dogs, the most research has been done. They've been shown to be the most effective out of the different livestock guardian animals. The dogs, they're living with the livestock. They'll help protect the animals during the day and the night. So while you'll still have to care for the LGDs, livestock guardian dogs, of course, and that is a time and a money investment, but can offer that peace of mind for you. And this is a non-lethal method that I am heavily involved with researching. My colleague Dan Macon and I, we've put together resources. So we have a fact sheet all on selecting a livestock guardian dog puppy. Really, selection and that initial bonding process is going to make or break whether this dog will work for you. So I encourage you, if you are considering, or if you know anyone thinking about using one of these dogs, check out our fact sheets. And we're putting together quite a few papers, little manuals of how to effectively use them for your operation. And then lastly, I just have a few minutes left, but I wanted to go over some kind of underlying carnivore biology that I think can be really helpful to understand, especially as you're working with members of the public who may be asking lots of questions of why can't we just remove this animal that's causing issues? And really this could be from raccoons all the way up to mountain lions. So when we're talking about damage, in this case, livestock losses, you first want to figure out what species in general is causing the problem, right? And this is true for any of your wildlife issues. You first need to know what species is the issue. But then also beyond that, especially when it comes to like losing pets or livestock, it is important about which individual did it. And when we're talking, when people are wanting to use lethal removal, if you don't ID which individual did it, you could be removing the wrong individual. And really, to know exactly which individual did it, really DNA is going to be the best bet. And so that's where, you may have heard that East Bay coyote incidents where there have been 5, and they've all through DNA been linked to the same individual. And this has allowed them, as they're going through trying to remove that coyote, because it is a public safety threat, to know if they're actually catching the right coyote or not. But oftentimes we don't have access to DNA to know exactly which individual did it. And also we need to think through the effects of lethal control from a biological perspective. And so briefly, let's say this is your property outlined in red. You have one mountain lion that, luckily perfectly aligns with your property, its home range. And you have neighboring mountain lions, right? Mountain lions and coyotes, territorial. So they'll have split up their different territories. shown here in each box. But you have an issue, and you decide, you know, you've lost your goat, and you want to remove this individual animal. Now, of course, with the new rules, you can't do this with mountain lions, but I'll just use them as an example. You can think coyote, let's say. You remove this individual. What's going to happen next? Remember, this is good habitat. So potentially you have one new arrival, and this one is less likely to go after your other goats. And that would be, you know, a win. This is kind of what people hope for when they're using lethal control. So the new individual that has replaced the old one is better in terms of, you know, less of a risk to your animals. But what if the new individual is more likely to go after your animals? So what if you've removed an adult male that has this established home range, and you now have a young male who, in general, young males across species oftentimes are linked with higher rates of damage. So you could actually be making your problem worse. And even worse from that is, what if instead of just having one individual's home range on your property, everyone has shifted their home range, right? The neighboring animals figured out that, oh, this property is empty. They all shift, and instead of one, now 3 of them have decided to split your property amongst themselves. So now, instead of having one individual to worry about whether they're going to go after your goats, you now have to worry about 3 individuals and whether any of them may go after your goats. So you can potentially, by altering these population dynamics, make your problem worse. And I think about this oftentimes with coyotes, where, you know what, if you're seeing your neighborhood coyote, but it's not causing any problems, you want that individual to remain. Because if you get rid of that individual that's, you know, not causing issues, you may be making way more problems to yourself. And people don't often think about this. And lethal control in general is it's never going to be a permanent solution. You're always going to have new individuals moving in. So if you haven't solved the underlying reason, especially when we're talking coyotes, you know, if your neighbor is feeding coyotes, you get rid of the one that's causing a problem, you're just going to have another problem coyote, because you haven't resolved that underlying issue that led to coyotes losing their fear and becoming more aggressive in your neighborhood. So I think that's important to remember. All right, I think that's time. Thank you so much. I know that was a lot of information, but I wanted to cover many species, depending, you know, wasn't sure which animals different people may have issues with or often face questions about from members of the public. If you have any questions whatsoever, here's my email. More than happy to delve deeper into any of these issues or other species that I didn't address today. Please feel free to reach out. Let's see, are there any questions?